I studied this chart on the plane this morning longer than you would play a game of Sudoku. And it was more fascinating because this chart tells you a lot about beef production in the different parts of the world. The longer you look at it, the more interesting I found it. Let me give you a couple of examples. The left-hand column talks about the pastures in millions of hectares per country. It's pretty straightforward. How many hectares of production of pasture land is there in Argentina? 99 million hectares in Argentina, 380 million in Australia. Pretty straightforward. How many acres of pasture land in those countries? But then the second column from the right, it talks about beef production in kilograms per hectares per year. Now that goes to how much per acre is produced. And that's where it kind of really got interesting because it begins to talk about something along the lines of a measure of efficiency. Has a lot to do with rainfall, I think, maybe a lot to do with the resources in the country, things of that nature, which sheds a lot of light on the type of systems that exist in that country. 34 kilograms per hectare per year in Argentina, 5 in Australia, 49 in Brazil, 80 in Canada, 14 in China, 49 in the US, 54 kilograms per hectare per year in New Zealand. The last column, beef production per kilogram per head of livestock. In the U.S., top the chart there at 125 kilograms per head, which there, in my view, there talks about the intensive production that you see with the number of feed yards that we have in the U.S. So I think it's a huge comparison chart that demonstrates the types of systems that exist in these major beef producing countries. These charts this PowerPoint will be made available to you. Take a look at it because it really, in a very demonstrable way, demonstrates the type of practices that goes on in these countries, but not necessarily in a judgmental way. It just demonstrates that the environmental factors that exist on the ground say a lot about what they're capable of doing in those countries. In the U.S., we have access to a lot of corn. In drier climates, they have access to a lot of grass. And so I think that it fundamentally demonstrates the type of systems that they're able and the types of beef systems that they have there. But studying the chart, I think, demonstrates that, and I think more than anything demonstrates why we have a diversity of beef production in the U.S., and this chart really demonstrates that. But one of the things that also, in the context of the global population, at the end of the day, boils down to food security. If you take a look at the top 10 food insecure countries in the world, 8 of them are in Africa. The other 2 are China and India. Yet you ask yourself the question, China is fairly wealthy, has huge surplus of reserves, and India yet has a wheat surplus. So there are 3 major reasons that there are food insecurity. One is shortage of food, one is an inability to get food to people that need it, and one is the inability for people to buy food. But at the end of the day, food security boils down to food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient amounts of safe, nutritious, and affordable food that provides the foundation for an active and healthy lifestyle, a healthy and active life. So one of the fundamental things we'll have to continue keeping in mind as we move forward on sustainability is bearing in mind that we'll need to ensure food security for people as we work to improve the sustainability of the food we produce. But one of the things that occurs as economies grow is their eating habits change. This has been referred to by Jerry and by Jason. And we'll talk specifically, and we've talked in very general terms, that as people's well-being, economic well-being grows, they eat more protein. Let's look at China specifically. From 1976 to 2010, in the blue line there, China's GDP grew from US dollars per person from around $100 per person to about $2,200 per person. Huge growth in GDP. Their kilograms per person of overall meat, this is overall meat, went from about 8 kilograms per person on an annual basis to 50. Duplicate this in all the countries around the world where their economies are growing tremendously, and you can imagine the tremendous growth of protein that will occur as these economies grow. I was reading a little book this morning, and from 2000 to 2007, developing countries' economies grew double, GDP growth grew double what developed countries' economies grew. And that has a bigger impact on protein consumption than economic growth does in developed countries. Why? Because they're beginning from a much smaller base. If we, in developed countries, have an increase in income, we're already eating a fair amount of protein. So an increase in income in developed countries doesn't have as huge an impact in protein consumption as a small increase in economic growth does in developing countries does. And this chart in China's eating habits shows that. The pie chart over on the right-hand side shows meat consumption globally. China consumes 29% of the world's meat. That's pork, poultry, and beef. The U.S. consumes 17%. The rest of the world consumes 54%.
Thank you, Brian. We were asked to speak about the beef system, so we wanted to speak a little bit about the different environments in which cattle are raised. So we have 2 slides here just to talk a little bit about that. And for us not only to think about the food that is provided through the livestock system, but also the relation between man and beast, the cultural issue of cattle ranching on smaller and larger scale. We have some cattle in the Alps with bells around their necks so that people can hear them when they're coming home in the evening. We've got a black Angus, and then we've got a Nelore in Brazil in a very bucolic sort of open environment. And it was just for us to think a little bit about how diverse and how different regions are, and how we have to work on regional solutions or regional issues in order to increase productivity or to continue to grow our beef production. I mentioned earlier the difference between Bos indicus and Bos taurus. If we take, just as an example, the average carcass weight of an animal harvested in Brazil is about 240 to 250 kilos. In the US, it's about 40% more. That's genetics, that's a more traditional culture of producing beef from Bos taurus, from European type cattle, from native type cattle. They've been developing, and Brian spoke about increased productivity over the last number of years. All of that experience has to be taken to regions, mostly subtropical or tropical regions, where the Bos indicus are prevalent, and we need to think about getting the 40% increased carcass weight on those animals in the environment in which they habitate, because one cannot transport the Bos taurus to the tropical region, nor the Bos indicus to the colder regions. And this slide, I think it's interesting for us to think about. In Africa, cattle are used to plow the land. In India, religious symbol. The biggest livestock herd in the world is in India, but they're not harvested for production. But when we think in terms of environment, we have to take all of this into account. Means of transportation. Cattle have been used for many, many years in South America, but particularly in Africa. And when we see cattle on feed, it's interesting for us to think that probably only about 2 to 3% of all the cattle on the globe are in a feedlot at this time. It's a very, very small percentage. Although it's concentrated in certain regions, and it might be something that we highlight when we think about production. It's less than 3% of all the cattle on the globe that are in a feed yard somewhere around the world today, and mostly in the US. So for us to finalize, nobody has asked us to stop talking. We just put up this message here at the end, which all of that, we present all of this thinking about how do we continue to feed the world, how do we continue to increase productivity. That's the message from Cargill, and that's the message from JBS. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Brian. Thank you very much.